So let's look at some of the other bowl games, the championship, the semifinal games, and we'll start with TCU and Michigan. And the expectation was that Michigan was just going to steamroll this team. They're going to run all over them, and that would be that. That is not how it played out. So we'll just talk about some names in general. We don't need to recap the show. That's what the Cover 3 podcast is for. Are
you cheating on me on another podcast?
No, I'm not on that podcast, but I watch it to catch up on the recaps. I do cheat on you on the Pick Six podcast, but
okay.
But Rick, you're my first love. So just that podcast doesn't mean anything. This is the one that means everything.
Okay, now we can go on with the show. We got that cleared up.
So I want to talk to you specifically about Mazi Smith, who's an interior defensive lineman, and Bruce Feldman for The Athletic, and he works for Fox as well and does a fantastic job. Comes up with a freak list every summer of just these insane athletic football players, and the 40 times, the bench press, the squats, all the things they do in the weight room to get your attention. And they may eventually one day be a first-round pick or just guys to watch as you go through the college football season. Mazi Smith, I think, was number 1 back in August, and the athleticism is there, and you see it. But for me, and not so much necessarily the TCU game, just over the course of this season, Rick, it's one of those situations where you have this guy who's a freakish athlete, who's strong, who's quick for his size, all those things, but it doesn't show up consistently on tape. I want to get your thoughts on what you think of Mazi Smith, the player, but also if you are in the same, are you thinking the same along those same lines as I am as an evaluator? How does that sort of mold your perception of when you want to take this player and what you can do with him once you get him in the building?
There's no question about the kid's athletic ability, but does it translate to the field when you're watching it on tape? And I'm just looking at my notes here, and I said that. I said, this is a big, thick, athletic nose tackle, but I don't see that athletic ability always translating to what you're watching on tape. I watched the Iowa game. I specifically said here, really struggled in Iowa versus the run. But then you see him flash, get off the ball, change direction like he looks like a linebacker, and run down a screen in that same game. Then he go and he'll play with a high ped level. He'll give too much ground versus some of the double teams that he has to take on. Then the next thing you know, he plays with knee bend, jerks some guy, does some phenomenal quick twitch move to find the ball carrier and make the play. So that's what's going to go on in a lot of these draft meetings. You have this guy that has this, if you want to call it, or as you labeled, this freak athletic ability for his size, but you don't always see it show up on the tape. And the one thing that I will say, in the Ohio State game, you kind of saw what he can potentially be, because I thought that was his best game of the year. The question becomes, is he an underachiever? Because most of the guys that I've missed on were guys that had this freak athletic ability, but did not play up to that athletic ability, and it didn't show up every time when you put the tape on.
Yeah, and I've talked to scouts that cover Michigan, and they just wonder, how long do you keep saying this guy, it's going to work, and then it's when you're talking about maybe a top 50 pick or whatever, and then you have to come to the realization that maybe he's not a top 50 pick. And for me, last year that guy was DeMarvin Leal, excuse me, out of Texas A&M. There's a lot of media buzz that he was a first-round pick, and I watched him play, and I said, okay, I'm not seeing it, and he ended up going in round 3. He's a good football player. He get a lot better, but I think sometimes the media perception isn't the reality among evaluators in the league, and we'll see how Mazi Smith, the pre-draft process goes for him. There's no doubt that he's physically has all the tools. It's just a matter of putting it together. Another player who's physically gifted, that's one word for it, and he's starting to put it together consistently when he's healthy, is Quentin Johnston, and he had a pretty big game for TCU as well. I'll just put this question to you. I'm not sure where your sort of draft mindset is on wide receivers, whether you want a big or a small guy just in general, but Quentin Johnston versus Jordan Addison, who is much smaller, obviously, and you have a need at wide receiver. Is there one guy you prefer to the other based on size, or is it a whole bunch of issues that you have to take into account?
Well, when you look at Quentin Johnston and his size, but as we talked about on an earlier podcast, he moves like a little receiver. He is a freak athlete that can run, but when you see him try to break down, make people miss in space, his ability to drop his weight, getting into and out of his cuts to separate from the DB, That's pretty unique for a big man. So if you got a big man with little man movement skills, that's a pretty unique trend as you go through. So he's definitely the number one receiver on my board. I've seen some big receivers that maybe I will call them slower twitched athletes, or just straight line speed guys. But this guy has it all. And I think as he continues to grow and develop into this league, he has a chance to be a superstar receiver in this league. And he has the most upside out of any of the receivers that I've evaluated so far as we get into this process. Addison on the other side, to me, and I said this before, he's Devontae Smith. He's smaller, but he's fast. He's elusive. He can make catches. He's very competitive with the ball in the air. He's competitive with the ball in his hands after the catch. And I think he's going to be a very good player as well. But I'm always going to go with the guy that has size, unique athletic ability, and he likes to play the game.
Yeah, Quentin certainly has all those things. And Addison, speaking of which, he is, I think he's injured. He's out of the bowl game for USC, but he has declared for the draft, which is also not a surprise. And he will almost certainly be a first-round pick. So let's talk about some players on the TCU side. Max Duggan, he'll be at the Senior Bowl, and he's probably one of the toughest quarterbacks in the NFL. In college football.
He's not in the NFL yet, but
he could end up being one of the toughest quarterbacks once he gets to the NFL. But I think in a previous podcast, we talked about him briefly, and you likened him a little bit to Trace McSorley. He feels like a Taysom Hill type in that he's not a guy you want starting, but he's physically, he can offer something in the run game. I want to get your thoughts on this, but I'm guessing he's a day 3 target, a developmental guy. And when you draft these quarterbacks in day 3, in the back of your mind, in addition to the developmental part, are you thinking, okay, this is a guy that can run our scout team and help with sort of athletic quarterbacks we might face over the course of our schedule? Or is it a different mindset when you draft someone like that?
No, I would say he has continued to grow on me as this process has gone. And you look at him in the Kansas State game, in that Big 12 championship game. I mean, that gives you a pretty good glimpse of who he is as a player. But the one thing that you can't discredit him for is his competitive spirit, his leadership ability, how that team rallies around him. Now, he may not be the most gifted thrower. You know, I watch him and he makes some incredible throws. It's like, wow. And then I see him leading receivers across the middle of the field, and it's like you're watching a movie and you're seeing, I know this is going to be a train wreck. Do I still watch this, or do I turn my head? And then you see the arm talent, and he's got a strong enough arm to make all the throws at the next level here. But then some of the deep throws, he's going to lay up and put too much air under the ball and underthrow some of the receivers. And I likened him to a little bit one of my favorite movies, Major League, just a bit outside on some of the throws when he goes. But then he'll miss a throw, he'll make a mistake. It's like water off of a duck's back. He comes right back in, and the next thing you know, he makes some plays with his legs, and he will battle you till the end, until that final whistle blows, and he's going to give you everything he has, and that's going to appeal to a lot of teams. And I wouldn't be surprised, depending on what he does down at the Senior Bowl, and I'm very excited to go down and see how he stacks up against some of these other, I would say, second-tier type quarterbacks, because you can't discredit what he's done for TCU. And the reason TCU is in the Natty, or the national championship game, is a lot to do with Max Duggan, who wasn't even starting in the beginning of the year, and actually, I believe, was beat out before he came back on the scene again.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I wanted to bring that up. So, right, he wasn't the starter at the beginning of the year, and he said, I'll be the best backup I can be. And it sounds hokey on some level, but when you're an evaluator, how important is that to hear from a guy that you want leading your team at some point?
Well, usually some of those guys will bail and just say, I'll ride this thing out, and then maybe hit the transfer portal, which seems to be the popular thing to do now, since there were 8,000 transfers in the portal this year.
Crazy.
But that tells you that this kid is a competitor. And even though he got beat out, he stuck with the program. He kept believing in himself. And usually when he got the opportunity to start again, they couldn't get him back off the field. And he is the reason why TCU is in the national championship game right now.
Yeah, it's a fun story and sort of a reminder that just because you're not a 5-star or you're not starting at the beginning of the year or the end of the previous year, it doesn't mean your NFL future is dead. It just means sometimes you're not in the right place, and sometimes you don't have the opportunity. When it comes, you have to sort of seize it. And Max Duggan has done that and then some. A guy who seized the opportunity in that TCU game on the losing side was wide receiver Ronnie Bell from Michigan. He'll be at the Senior Bowl as well. 6 catches, 135 yards. And if you just turned on one game this season and watched that, you said, oh, Ronnie Bell's a first-round pick. Ronnie Bell's not going to be a first-round pick. He'll probably go in day 3, I would imagine, in part because he's not in the same athletic conversation as Quentin Johnston or Jordan Addison, for example. But there are things that he may do at Michigan against Big Ten opponents that he will struggle to do at the next level against NFL defensive backs. But when you see a performance like that, does that sway your opinion at all? Or you know who Ronnie Bell is? He just had a good game.
I think you have a pretty good idea of who he is. So when I broke him down this year, just reading through some of my notes, nothing really special stuck out on the film from a physical standpoint. He's had some durability issues in the past. The best asset are his hands. He can really catches the ball well. But he looks to me like kind of a one-speed receiver upfield in the routes. Really struggled to separate deep. Most of his production came on underneath and short type and intermediate throws. He does need some route work, but he does have some quickness into and out of his breaks. He's not an electric playmaker with the ball in his hands after the catch. So I don't want to call him an average Joe because he's better than an average Joe. But what is going to separate him from the rest of those receivers maybe in that third day, if he goes and runs well at the combine, if that may move him up some, but you always have to go. Not one game does a player make. And it was great to see how he performed. And he performed in the bright lights on a national stage and came through for them. But I think his ceiling is limited because of the lack of top-end speed and the lack of the top-end athleticism.
Yeah, and I don't want to undersell him. You're exactly right. Now, credit to him. He made a lot of tough contested catches down the field in that game to keep that game close. So
key point, contested.
That's right. And that could be good if you're a glass half full guy, or it could mean that you're not winning with speed off the snap, which is to your point. Fair enough. All right, let's talk about the Ohio State-Georgia game. And let's start with the biggest matchup in my mind, Kelee Ringo versus Marvin Harrison Jr. Oh. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is probably the best player in next year's draft class. That's not a quarterback, and maybe even is a quarterback. I'm sure Caleb Williams would like a word about that, but he's a special player. He would be the first wide receiver taken in this class. He might be a top 5 pick. Kelee Ringo has routinely been mentioned as cornerback 1 in this class. And I talked to you about this earlier. If we look back at last year's cornerback, the 2 guys that went Sauce and Derek Stingley Jr., and then a few years before that, we saw J.C. Horn go 9, and I think Pat Surtain went 10. Kelee Ringo is probably a distant 5th in that group. You think that's about right?
Yeah, no, I would agree with you there. I think he's behind those guys. I know he has phenomenal size. He's a good athlete for his size. But when you're stacking all these corners up in the draft, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, Gonzalez from Oregon, and one of my favorite guys, Porter Jr. from Penn State. All these guys, the litmus test, and the guy you want to watch him is how do they match up against Harrison, and were they able to shut or at least keep him in somewhat under control? Because I agree, he's probably going to be the best non-quarterback coming out in next year's class if he keeps going the way he's going, and he is definitely a difference maker. But you're measuring these corners on how they match up against an elite receiver like that, because they're going to face more than one elite receiver in NFL. They're going to have to face those probably on a weekly basis. The issue I have with Ringo is I didn't think he played up to the same level to match what Harrison did. And Harrison had a big game, and I didn't think Ringo had such a big game. And that was a chance for him to go out there and show that, hey, I am the best. I am the number 1 corner in this draft. But coming out of watching that game, I don't know if that's the case or not. And I even like Witherspoon, your corner from Illinois, who I think is a small, but he's a heck of a football player.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So I think I'm at the point in the conversation, and this is just because of this game, but I've been thinking about it, and as we go through this process of watching all these players, Kelee Ringo is not going to be my cornerback one when it's all said and done. He may not end up being a top 15 pick, and we'll see how that plays out. But you mentioned your guy, Joey Porter Jr., and I charted every snap he had against Marvin Harrison when they played back in the fall. So there are 32 reps, Porter versus Harrison. Harrison finished 3 receptions for 40 yards. Of those 3 receptions, Porter was playing zone on an over route, and he didn't follow him. So, I mean, that's one catch. That's not on Porter. Another, he's playing 10 yards off, and Stroud hit Harrison on a hot route. So, again, it was a 10-yard route. He only got 3 yards after the catch. That's not necessarily a win by Porter, but it's not a loss. And then Harrison versus press man beat Porter with physicality at the top of the route on a dig, and he made a contested catch in tight coverage for 11 yards. Again, that's not the worst-case scenario for Joey Porter. If it forces Marvin Harrison, the best wide receiver in college football, to make a contested catch on an 11-yard completion that required everything to go right from the snap to the quarterback throw to the route run by the receiver. So we didn't see that consistently from Kelee Ringo, and I just think that's probably something we'll be talking about as we go through this process. Another guy that didn't flash in that game.
I'll just tell you, Porter shut down your guy too, I believe, from Purdue. Your
Charlie
little
Jones,
rat hole player, yeah,
Charlie, yeah,
that you love in the 3rd round, who was a heck of a football player.
I love Charlie. I don't know if I love him in the 3rd round. I sentimentally I do. I think he'll probably last longer than that. But yeah, Joey Porter is legit. Before I move off of Joey Porter, let me ask you this, because this is one of the, not concerns, but one of the things I noted about Joey Porter, and it happens a lot in college because the rules are a little different. What happens when you get a cornerback who's so physical at the top of the route that he would get called for holding on every play in the NFL, and he gets away with it in college?
Yeah, that stuff you're hoping is going to get corrected with coaching, because that's why it takes some of these corners. Rarely do you have a Sauce Gardner do what he's doing in his first year. But a lot of these corners aren't going to get away with what they're able to get away with at the college level. And that's a lot of grabbing and a lot of things that happen down the field. And plus, it's only usually a 15-yard penalty, where in the NFL, it's going to be a spot foul wherever you're down. So all of that to me is technique. I think what separates some of these guys, and what you try to find out as you go through the pre-draft process, is, can they locate the ball in the air and do not let the receiver make the catch? So there are guys that I've seen that, okay, I'm not going to touch the guy. They're in perfect position, but yet that receiver goes up and makes a play because they can't find the ball in the air. So what you're trying to do is do a lot of drills, a lot of things, a lot of tape you're going to try to cut up so your coach can see, can this guy make a play on the ball in the air when he's in a contested situation? Or is he in the hip pocket of the receiver, and does he have a knack to go and make a play? That was the big question, and I don't want to jump to another guy, but on Gonzalez, when he left Colorado and ended up going to Oregon, and then this year, okay, he all of a sudden, I think he had 4 interceptions, but all of a sudden you see another big corner, but the question on him was his ball instincts and awareness, and you can tell that he really developed that and was much better this year at Oregon than he has been in the past.
And you pointed out he could be in the conversation for CB1 too, depending on how this thing plays out, because again, another big long corner with ball skills. So let's talk about another player that didn't have his best game, but I don't think it matters in the draft sense. But Jalen Carter, you didn't hear his name called a lot, just in terms of watching over the broadcast. Any concerns, anything to worry about there? No. Or it's just, right, you just watch the next game and say, okay, he'll be back.
Yeah, no, but you do see some flashes now. There's a couple of times when he wanted to turn it on, and he went around the Ohio State guards like they didn't even put a hand on him. So when he wants to turn it on, I don't know if anyone can block him at the collegiate level, and there's going to be a lot of pros that are going to have a hard time blocking him as well. The question may come back to is, why is he not doing that every snap, especially in a game like what was at stake last Saturday night against Ohio State? So that may come into question. So you're going to try to get those answers as you go through this pre-draft process. We used to try to even cut out. We knew all the good that these players did, but when we brought them in for interviews at the combine, we try to cut up a lot of their bad plays or plays that they didn't show effort and try to hit them directly. Why are you playing like this? Or when I see this snap, why don't you play like that every time? So those are some of the things that these kids will get challenged with when they're sitting in those interviews, because you want to really dig down and try to find out who these kids are. And, the tape doesn't lie. The tape is your resume. And so you're going to show these players some of these clips where maybe they were loafing, maybe they didn't get off the block. Then all of a sudden he looks like he's unblockable. Well, why aren't you showing that on every snap?
Did you ever get any responses when you confronted players with bad tape and their response to you made it clear that you didn't want to draft this person?
It was all, rainbows and butterflies when it first came in. How's your family and blah, blah, blah. Let's get on this tape. And then all of a sudden you see little beads of sweat starting to come up on this. And then it's kind of start rolling down the side. It's kind of like when Pete Prisco starts getting with us on some of these drafts and you start to challenge him. He sweats a little bit now where you put him under pressure.
Yeah, Pete's got a lot of catch-up work to do too, and he'll he was peacocking earlier about he's on me about Mac Jones because I was a Mac Jones guy, but we'll see. There's time. The jury's still out on Mac Jones. You can't, as you've noted, Rick, you can't give up on a quarterback after a year and a half.
Are you giving up on Zach Wilson after a year and a half or two?
I am. That one I got to sell that lemon because I don't think that's going to run. We'll see. All right, let's talk about another player on the other side of the ball for Ohio State on the defensive side, Zach Harrison, who we haven't talked about yet on this podcast. He is long. He is 35-plus inch arms, and he looks the part. He passes the eye test, as you like to say. I don't think he's particularly bendy based on what I saw over the course of this season, but he flashed. Talk about flash. He flashed at times in that game. And Georgia has some dudes that are going to get drafted. Broderick Jones is one of them. Their offensive tackle who's going to go pretty high. What do you see about Zach Harrison, and what do you think about him overall over the course of the season?
When you see watch his body type just on tape, it's like that's the first guy you want to jump off the bus with. So you can say, here's our team. And they all look like him coming off the bus. So he's a first team all bus player. What I didn't like about him is I do think he plays hard. I do think he needs some time to develop, especially with his pass rush moves. But he was one of those guys when I watched tape, and I didn't get back to see this game this past weekend, but when I watched tape on him earlier during the season, he was more disruptive than productive. And what I'd like to see is a little bit less disruption, a little bit more production, especially when he can close and get to the quarterback. And those are some of the things I think technically can be cleaned up. And I do agree with you, what do you want to call it, bendy or a little stiff through his lower body. Those are the things, because he's not going to be one of those edge finesse type pass rushers. He's going to have to come off. He's going to have to one-arm you. He's going to have to use speed to power to collapse the offensive tackle into the pocket. I don't have any question about the effort he plays with. I just think, and I don't want to say he's non-instinctive, I just wish he was more productive than disruptive.
Gotcha. And before we move off this game and get on with the old podcast here, I scribbled this down, and I'm curious what you think about this, because you're big on these players playing these games. You talked up how important it was for the Alabama kids to do it and what it meant to them. And at the end of that game, you saw them, pretty emotional that they got through this thing together, even though it wasn't a national championship game. They finished with a flourish, and, they're all huge Nick Saban guys, this, that, and the other. Do you think Ohio State wins that game if Jackson Smith-Njigba plays?
I don't know, because I don't know the extent of that hamstring injury.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a factor all year. So I don't know how long this hamstring bothered him or if he ever fully got back healthy. So, yeah, if he was healthy and you saw the player that he was last year, he definitely is going to help them and potentially win that football game. But I don't want, without me knowing exactly how severe or significant that hamstring is, it's hard to discredit him. But if a player is healthy and is old school, if you want to call me old school or however it is, when you got a chance to throw the ball out into the schoolyard, go out there and compete. Don't turn it down, because there were some players that I watched that were getting interviewed on TV. Their teammates are out there busting their hump to win a bowl game while these guys are sitting on the sideline eating hot dogs, saying they're getting ready for the draft, getting interviewed by all the media people. And I don't know, that would bother me as a competitor and as a person. If I've been with that team and I've been with these guys for 3 or 4 years, and I've been through training camp and I've been through all the ups and I've been all the downs, I want to go out swinging with my teammates. And so that's what bothers me the most. I'm not saying they're not competitive. I'm not saying that they're not going to be really good football players in the NFL. But when I saw every Alabama kid and every Kansas State kid go out there and compete in that Sugar Bowl, and it wasn't for an advancement to get to the national championship game, that spoke volumes to me of what those kids' character are and what their football character is.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And look, I'm not going to begrudge Smith and Jigba for choosing what he thinks is in his best interest. I was just legitimately curious because that you could argue they should have won the game anyway had they made that field goal at the end. C.J. Stroud had a fantastic performance, and credit to him for that. I think they would have loved to have had Smith and Jigba out there, but clearly he wasn't. All right, let's talk about that Alabama-Kansas State game again in more detail here. We've talked about Bryce Young and our love affair with him. Let's talk about your dude, Felix Anudike-Uzomah, the edge rusher, number 91, who is another physical freak, to use my term there. And he went up much of that afternoon against Tyler Steen, the offensive tackle for Alabama, who will hear his name called on draft weekend as well. What'd you make of that matchup, and how did your guy fare?
Which guy? I liked both of them, but I do like the defensive end from Kansas State. And so I wanted to really hone in on that matchup to see, who was going to win that battle, because Steen, I knew if he was able to go out there and perform, and probably he's a borderline right now, 3rd, 4th round pick, because he's a big athletic left tackle. I just wish he played a little bit more grit at times. It anchored a little bit better versus power, but he has all the physical traits that you're looking for to develop as an NFL offensive lineman. What drove me a little crazy was when they reduced the defensive end from Kansas State. What I mean reduced is they put him head up over the tackle, or between the tackle and the tight end. And that's not what his game is. And so you have a 250-pound, 55-pound kid trying to hold the point versus these big, massive bodies in line. And even as a pass rusher, trying to run upfield on these guys in a small area. All of a sudden, there were about 5 or 6 snaps I seen they put him in a wide 9 technique, or outside the tackle of the offensive lineman, outside the shoulder of Steen. And when they put him on the outside and he pinned his ears back, he got a quarterback hit. He drew a holding penalty, and that kid was a going Jesse coming off the edge. And that's how you have to use him if you're going to draft him.
So let me ask you that to follow up on that. When you're playing sort of a wide 9, you're not as able to help out in run support, at least, maybe setting the edge perhaps. But does that mean he's situational early on in his career? Like, what's the game plan?
I think you have to. Yeah, I think those are the discussions you have in your draft meetings. Okay, this kid is a very good player and a very good pass rusher. If you get him on the outside edge of a tackle and let him cut loose and get upfield and get after the quarterback, where he may struggle, if we're going to say that we're going to reduce our defensive ends and play him at what we refer to as a 5 technique, or head up on the offensive tackle, or in the gap between the tackle and the tight end, he's going to have a hard time probably not being as productive rushing the passer. And he'll hold up against the run because he does play with heavy hands, but he's not going to be as effective as when he's lined up wide.
All right, so let's talk about, and you like Anudike-Uzomah a little more than I do, but I'm coming around on him.
Keep watching. You'll like him.
No, you're right. And I have liked Tyler Steen from the start. I think you're right about, he's not going to go. He's going to be a top 10 pick, but that doesn't mean he can't be a productive NFL player. But let's talk about some of Tyler Steen's teammates. And this is one of my favorite players, and I've loved him going back to the start of the football season. And I know you're high on him as well. And not talked about much nationally over the first few months of the season. People know who he is now. And I thought he had a really good game safety, if you want to call him that, but he plays a lot in the slot, and he can do just about anything. Brian Branch, what's he, number 14?
14.
Yeah.
14. Yeah, no, he is in Alabama's defense called a star position. It's kind of a nickel hybrid safety / nick corner. He had a big game this game. I mean, he had an interception, he had a sack. He's physical and run support. He can cover. I think where teams are going to have, if he does come out, what the question will be is I think his best position at the NFL is going to be free safety. But you really never see him play in the deep half of the field. So what you're guessing is he going to be as instinctive of a football player when he's back that deep and as he is when you see him playing over the slot right now? So those are the questions that will be asked. I think he has all the physical traits and ability to be an excellent free safety, but you really haven't seen it. So that part of the equation, you're going to have to project.
And his teammate in the secondary, Jordan Battle, had an interception on an underthrown wheel route, I believe, in the Kansas State game. High point of the ball, made a great catch. He is not the athlete, I don't think, that Brian Branch is. And even though he plays much more in the deep half of the field, what does Jordan Battle give you if you're an NFL team in terms of bringing, what does he bring to the secondary?
Well, what he brings is his instincts, because he may not be as athletic, but he's a well-built, well-developed kid. But he knows, and he has a natural awareness to put himself in position to make plays on the field. So that's what, if you want to go into our good football player category that may not be the, going to win the gold medal at the combine this year, but know how to play the game, that describes Jordan Battle to me. He's going to get exposed some, I think, in the NFL with the more space he has to play with. But what he'll make up for lack of athleticism will be his instinct and his natural feel as a football player.
Yep. No, I agree with all that. And I think it's a situation where you could get him, he could go on day 2, but if you get him even on early day 3, that doesn't mean he's not going to play a lot. That doesn't mean he's not going to be productive, because I'm guessing you would agree, if you're an instinctive player, but not the athlete, you'd rather have that than the high-end athlete who's not instinctive. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we talked about a little bit earlier, is the high-end athlete that's not instinctive or not a good football player. Those are the guys I missed on. Those are the underachievers. They don't play up to their ability they should play up to, or they're just not natural at playing the game of football. There are other kids that end up having great careers that may not be the gold medal winner at the combine, but they know how to play the game. They have natural instincts. They have great vision. And to me, that's what Jordan Battle is.